Chapter 12 On Paths of Night. There was no need of a lamp in the room to undress by, for the stars had risen, and the room was silvery with their shining. Gentian's night-robe by star shine was even lovelier than it had been by lamp light. The stars in it had a clearer radiance, and the blue quivered in a light all its own. The minute that Gentian had slipped out of her clothes and into this loveliness, she felt that she had become as light as the gown, light as a feather, she thought, but then she knew at once that that was not right. She was lighter than a feather, for a feather must sometime flutter to the earth, but she felt that if she were to leave the ground, she could stay in the air as long as ever she liked. Oh, how wonderful, she thought. Of course, she had climbed the air very lately in the clear country, but in that crystal land it did not seem like such a marvelous thing to do. Here, in her mother's little brown house, right down here in the village where she lived, to climb the air would be a different, stranger thing. Gentian got onto the one chair in the bedroom to gaze at herself in her mother's high mirror. The night-robe looked like a blue cloud fallen about her, and the stars in it shone out softly radiant, lighting her hair and face. She got down from the chair and went to the door, which she quietly opened. After hesitating there a minute, she went down the stairs. She stood in the doorway of the sitting room, looking at her mother and Kay, a merry laugh ready to break on her lips. When they should see her there in her glimmering night-robe, she wanted to watch the wonder grow in their eyes, but Dietra was bent over the statuette. Her eyes narrowed while her hands worked cleverly and quickly, making the wind boy's clustering curls. Her thoughts were all on her work, and she had forgotten where she was, even perhaps who she was. As for Kay, he sat beyond her at the other side of the table to get the lamplight too. His coppery hair was bent over his book, and his eyes, following the pages, never wavered. He was far out to sea, on a sailing vessel, lost in another world, another time. Gentian stood watching her mother and her brother for some minutes, but they did not look or sense that she was there. She could not get Kay's attention, of course, without disturbing her mother, and now that she saw how her mother was working with the intent, narrowed eyes that Gentian knew so well, she dared not disturb her. Her heart sank a little, for she had longed to show them her handiwork. But after a little waiting, there, unnoticed in the doorway, she quietly turned and went back up the stairs to her room. Well, in the morning she could show them. She would go to bed now, so she turned back to the bed, back the bedclothes, and after kneeling to say her bedtime prayer, got in. At once she fell asleep. But it was not in the way she or any other little girl usually falls asleep. The minute her head touched the pillow, she felt herself slipping into sleep as into deep water. Only, of course, sleep did not take her breath away, as water will when your head goes under. When her head went under in this water of sleep, her breath came lighter and lighter, easier and easier, until it was not like breathing at all. It was so light, and then she forgot everything. She thought of nothing. Of course, she could never tell about that. That was the very deepest sleep a person can know. And the next minute she was wide awake. She had slept only the briefest while, but because it had been so deep a sleep and so dreamless, it had rested her more than a whole night of just ordinary every night sleep. Now she was suddenly wide awake. wider awake than she had ever been in her life perhaps, here in her bed with the starlight pouring in at the window. She sat up, only it was not like sitting up at all, for she came up as lightly as the tulips had come up after the wind boy had run over them. And then she noticed that every movement she made was made as she thought it, as though her thoughts did the moving, and not her body at all. That was delightful. Thinking it, she got out of bed and went to the door. Why, this is the way the clouds move, and the wind, she thought. She went down the stairs as a petal floats from the cherry tree, and in a second she was standing on the grass in the lamplight, just outside the sitting-room window. She crossed her arms on the sill and looked in. Oh, if they would only look up now and see her! How amazed they would be! The masker had stood like this, looking in, and just at first they might think she was the masker, but right away they would know better, and Kay would laugh. But what would her mother say to her being out alone in the night? Well, Gentian knew very well that ordinarily her mother would not like it at all, that she would never allow her to do such a thing. But in the night robe that made her so light, in this starry brightness, everything was different. Her mother would surely be wise enough to see that. Why, in this starry brightness she was part of the night. She was the sky itself, and the night wind. She belonged out here. Dietra and Kay worked and read on, and never dreamed that Gentian was out there in the night, looking in at them. After a little she turned away and moved like a cloud across the little grass plot, through the hole in the hedge, down the grassy pass, to the stone steps that led up to the Tulip Garden. In the Tulip Garden, in the grassy center where the wind boy had slept, Gentian sat with her arms wrapped about her knees. She stayed that way for a long time, getting stiller and stiller. I'm still the way the night is still, she told herself, but after some while longer she began to feel how alone she was out here, how far from her mother and Kay, back there under the lamplight in the little brown house. And as she looked toward the little brown house, she saw Nan's light wink out in the attic. Was Nan in her starry brightness too, and would she come out into the soft night? Gentian thought of the wind boy. Why had she and Kay Saturday morning run away to play with the Clear children and left him behind? Well, she would not play with the Clear children again, unless they would let him play too. But they must find the masker. Tomorrow night at dusk they must do nothing but watch. And when they did catch it, and the wind boy had torn off the mask, how splendid for them all it would be. The wind boy would be happy again. He would look as he had looked that minute when he first awoke, here at noon, while Gentian was watching him. He would measure for silver sandals then, and the shoeman would be glad. He could go back to play with the Clear children, and be at home once again in the Clear land. And Gentian and Kay would play with him there, and with the others. And once the wind boy was happy, Mother could make her statuette look happy too, and ready to fly with all of him. For she would see him like that, once he was happy, and free of all that mask business. She would make him glad of his wings, and she would get the light across his brow. Well, perhaps the masker was hiding somewhere out here, perhaps in that black shadow over there by the white birch at the edge of the garden. Gentian looked hard but could see nothing, so velvet black was the shadow. Yes, the masker might very well be there, yet she was not a bit afraid at the thought. In her starry brightness she could not be afraid of anything so foolish and silly as that mask. Indeed, she could not remember now how it was that such a silly thing had ever frightened her. She turned her back on the velvet shadow. But her courage was not needed. The massacre was not lurking there. If the moonlight and starlight could have sifted through the leaves of the white birch, Gentian would have seen nothing but tulips, red, yellow, purple, and white, with their petals closed in the dew. Gentian now was looking toward the artist's house, and she thought of Rosemarie, alone asleep in her high nursery. What fun it would be if she and Kay could only have her for a playmate. But hadn't the artist half promised it Saturday morning, here in the Tulip Garden? If, when he came back, he should have forgotten. Gentian decided to remind him, for out here in her starry brightness, she saw how horrid it must be for Rosemarie, always alone. All the tulip gardens in the world, and automobiles, and pretty dresses, and famous grandfathers wouldn't make up to a little girl for being alone. I will be brave and speak to the artist about it, she promised herself. Then she looked off over the wood to the faraway mountains. They were as black and velvety as the shadow under the white birch. Nan came from the mountains. Gentian remembered. Perhaps she has gone back there now, in her starry brightness, for a night visit. I shall go and look for her there. Then she rose and went toward the mountains. She went right across the tulip beds, not bothering about the grassy paths, just as the wind boy had done. But that was all right, for the tulips did not even bend under her feet. I cannot tell you about her journey through air and starlight toward the mountains, for I have never run along the paths of night. Even Gentian herself never found words to tell it in, but she did come to the mountains, moving with her thought, and stood at the top of the very tallest one, just above the spruce and pine and birch trees, on a ragged ledge of gray, moss-covered rock. The village, as she looked back and down on it, was just a few pinpoints of light, but the sky was close. Oh, I want to know all about the stars, Gentian thought. Perhaps Nan can tell me. I shall ask her tomorrow or tonight if I find her here. How many, many worlds there must be. I want to go to all of them, and live in all of them, one after another, some time. Above the mountain top, just beyond a light that was not starlight, suddenly caught her glance. It was moving toward her along the paths of air. Gentian caught her breath, for she thought it might be Nan coming in her starry brightness. She stood waiting, watching. Slowly it came on toward her, through the starlight and the blue, and when it had come quite near, she saw that, although it was someone, it was not Nan. It was much too tall, and she knew that Nan, even in her starry brightness, could never have just this clear, steady radiance. Gentian, standing there on her stony ledge on the mountain top, became stiller than she had ever been in her life before. Yes, stiller than deep still. Her breath stopped. Her heart beat softly. It was as though she hardly lived. She stood straight and still with folded hands. And her eyes stayed open only because she dared not move her lids to cover them. The being passed very near her mountain top, moving slowly as to unheard holy music. He passed by, but as he passed, he turned his face and looked down at Gentian, standing still and small on the mountain top. At his look, she covered her eyes with her hands and sank down on the moss-covered rock. She lay curled there, remembering brightness and beauty lost in awe, but the face itself she never remembered, for it was not a face for a human child to see. When at last she looked up again, the bright being had passed by and was gone. It had passed behind the farthest mountain. For a minute Gentian wanted to follow to catch a glimpse again, if only from afar off. She took a step out into the air, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was the memory of her mother and Kay, or even more of her father back there, searching for his family somewhere in the everyday world. Whatever it was, it turned her about sharply and sent her running fast along the paths of night, toward the pinpoints of light that were the village and home. When she reached the Tulip Garden and floated down onto the grassy center, she saw that the little brown house was dark. Mother must have finished with the Wind Boy and Kay with his book, and both had gone to bed, but where would Mother think Gentian had vanished too when she saw her bed empty? Gentian had not thought of Mother's being frightened by her adventure. She ran up the air and across to her mother's open window. When she stood in the still, shadowy room, she was glad to be there. How it had happened that Dietra, when she came to bed, had failed to notice that Gentian was not there in her own little bed, I cannot tell you. But she had not noticed, surely, or she would not be sleeping peacefully now. Gentian listened to her even gentle breathing. I can never sleep in this starry brightness, she thought, as she stood glimmering in the room. It is too wonderful for just a little girl. So, quietly, not to disturb her sleeping mother, she slipped it off, and feeling for her plain little cotton nightgown on its peg in the dark closet, she put it on instead. Then, still moving very softly, she folded up the starry brightness and put it away in the lowest empty drawer of her closet. When she closed the drawer, she felt that she was closing a door into the sky, but it was so still in the house, and she felt so strange and lonely. She could not get into her own bed now and go to sleep. The memory of the brightness and beauty of that face that had turned toward her on the mountain top, and the way she had almost gone after it beyond the mountains, was too keen. Softly, uncertainly, she stole across and stood beside her mother's bed in the farthest shadow in the room. She bent and touched her mother's cheek with her own. "Who is that?" Dietra asked in a half-asleep voice. "Who?" "It's Gentian," Gentian whispered and crept in beside her. Dietra turned and folded an arm about her little girl. "Why, you're cold," she whispered. "Snuggle close." "Oh, may I stay and sleep here?" "Yes, but why? I thought you were so fast asleep." "No, I was out in the night. It was so big. And then came the angel. I wanted you." Dietra smiled sleepily to herself in the dark. "What strange dreams you have," she murmured. Then she lay thinking about her little girl and wondering about her for a long time. But Gentian had fallen asleep almost at once, folded securely in her mother's arms. Chapter 13. Kay and the Massacre. The next afternoon, Kay and Gentian took their homework out under the cherry tree. There was more than usual of it today, and they wanted to get it all out of the way before twilight, for at twilight they had promised each other to lie in wait for the massacre, and they hoped that the Wind Boy would come to join them. Even as they studied, they kept glancing up, half expecting to see him standing in the garden waiting for them. And several times Gentian was sure she spied a bit of his purple wings when the spring wind moved overhead in the cherry tree. "You really must study, Gentian," Kay at last cried, a little impatiently. "If you keep looking up there for him all the time and thinking about him, you'll never get done this afternoon. Then Mother'll keep us in tonight." Gentian sighed. "All right," she said, "I'll try," and she bent over her lesson book determinedly. Just then the Wind Boy did come, running down from the clear land and into the boughs of the cherry tree. But he made no more sound than the spring wind had already made there, so the children did not let themselves look up. He knelt in a forked branch, watching them for some time, but they did not lift their eyes from their books. He shook the boughs then, making the air sweet with cherry blossom smell. Still they did not look. He spread his purple wings and drifted to the grass, and standing directly before them looked down wistfully at the coppery tops of their bent heads. He had come to play with them. But if you are to play with a wind boy, you must first see him, and he has no way of getting your attention unless you are quite ready to give it. So he waited, now in vain, for his human playmates. At last, too proud to stay longer unwanted, he turned away and flew slowly over the hedge and back to the artist Tulip Garden. There he stretched himself out in the grassy center, where the sun was warmest, and stayed half asleep, waiting for twilight and time to watch for the massacre. But back under the cherry tree it was Gentian who was now nagging Kay. Really, Kay, unless you stop staring up at that nursery window, you'll never get done, and Mother won't let us out in the twilight, please. You see, Rosemary had come to her high nursery window and stood looking down at the brother and sister. She was hoping that Kay would soon stop working at stupid lessons and start climbing, for if she herself might not climb up the brown limbs of that old cherry tree among the budding blossoms, the next best thing was to watch somebody else doing it. But today, alas, he did not climb, and Rosemary, as the wind boy, turned away after a while, lonely and disappointed. After that, Kay and Gentian got along better with the work that must come before play. The wind boy didn't wait for twilight that night, but came back almost as soon as the people in the little brown house were through with supper. Gentian and Kay were out in the yard tossing a ball back and forth to each other, calling and laughing. The wind boy heard their happy voices before he came to the hedge. Gentian was the first to see him. "Oh, you've come," she cried. "We've been looking and looking for you, but it's not time to watch for the massacre yet. What shall we play till twilight?" She knew very well, of course, that the wind boy would not be able to catch or throw their ball, for she remembered that he could not even open the secret door that needed only a touch. In the clear land, you must know, the wind boy could open doors well enough and play ball too. It was only down here that he had no touch for things. "Let's play hide and seek," he suggested. "I'll count first." Hide and seek was a fine idea. The wind boy faced the cherry tree, and crossing his arms on the old brown trunk, shut his eyes against them. Away Gentian ran, almost before he had begun to count around the house, and out across the meadow at the back. There, in a hollow behind some huckleberry bushes, she crouched to hide, but Kay had not gone so far. He wanted to get his goal and fool the wind boy, who he thought must have heard Gentian running away around the house and would go in that direction, leaving him safe to slip in and get free. So very softly, moving on his toes, he got to the lilac hedge, and working his way in among the bushes. Once there, safely hidden, he stood erect. The wind boy did just as Kay had expected. When he had finished counting, he turned about and looked all around carefully. For an instant he looked straight at Kay's hiding place, and Kay felt that their eyes met, but they hadn't, for the wind boy turned away suddenly and ran in the direction Gentian had taken. Now Kay would have jumped from his hiding place and got his goal, but he heard a sound behind him. He turned to see what it was and stayed completely still, for there, standing against a tree trunk on the artist lawn, and looking back around it, as though in fear of someone's seeing it from the windows of the big house, was the massacre. It had come early tonight. Kay wanted to shout for the wind boy and Gentian, but that would do no good, he knew, for the massacre would only escape. Then he remembered the policeman who was to keep special watch every evening. He looked out from his leafy hiding place toward the street. Yes, there was the policeman just arriving for duty, but Kay did not call to him. No, he suddenly decided to catch the massacre for himself and have all the fun of waving the mask in the faces of the wind boy and Gentian when they came running back to the goal. It would take a little courage, but not much. The cape the masker wore had a peaked hood, and the mask stuck in under such an innocent-looking little hood was really more comical than dreadful. The masker really should wait for the twilight to deepen if it wanted to frighten people, but Kay didn't let himself laugh out loud, for that would have scared the masker away. After a minute, the masker left the concealment of the tree and ran, just as fast as it could, toward the hole in the hedge. To reach the hole, it had to pass Kay. He jumped out and grabbed at the flying cape. With a startled but stifled scream, the masker wrenched the cape from his grasp and dashed back across the grass, right toward the artist house. This time it did not stop to hide behind the trees, for Kay was after it. Right at once he realized that the masker was making for the secret door behind the syringa bush. Well, that should not happen again, not if he could help it. He ran faster than he had known he could run, taking a shortcut right across a bed of jonquils. That headed the masker off before it could get near the syringa bush. It swerved off and sped away in the direction of the Tulip Garden. Down long grassy paths it ran, its cape billowing out behind it, but Kay was gaining, and then the masker stopped bothering about the paths, and dashed through flower beds, over ferns, over fresh-planted places, and at last reached the foot of the stone steps leading up to the Tulip Garden, and Kay followed through everything, to what his mother or the artist would say about the ruin their feet were making. He gave not a thought at the time. He was after the masker, and he meant to catch it. He could only think of that. Just at the top of the steps the masker tripped over its cape and fell, sprawling. Kay, who was close behind and had not time to stop, tripped over the masker and fell, sprawling too. Up got the masker to its knees to run again, but Kay got a good clutch on the hem of its cape, and that was the end, for the cape was fastened securely by a strong hook at the neck. "There," cried Kay, springing up. "Now I've got you, you horrid thing that scares children and keeps the wind boy away from his comrades. I'm not afraid of you," and he reached for the mask to tear it off, but the masker itself pulled down the mask before Kay could, and Kay gave up his hold on the cape and fell back a step in utter dismay. For the mask coming off had brought the peaked hood with it, and there were the dancing dark curls, and the merry brown eyes, and the rosy cheeks of Rose-Marie, and she was laughing. Indeed, she was laughing so hard that her knees gave out, and she sank to the ground, shaking with mirth. "Oh, I wouldn't have tripped if I hadn't got to laughing," she said, when she could stop a little. "Didn't I fool you? Oh, wasn't it fun? You never guessed it was I all the time. How you can run, though." But Kay had nothing to say. He could only stare and stare. He had never been so near to Rose-Marie before, or dreamed anybody could be so pretty. At last he found his voice, and asked, "Was it always you, all the time?" He could hardly believe it. "Yes, of course. Didn't you guess? But how did you come by the mask at all?" "Oh, one day, when I was wondering what I should do, alone and wanting, so to play with you and your sister, but old Prinny, that's my governess, said I never could. I just found it. It was blowing about the hedge. Old Prinny's nose was buried in a book, and she never saw, so I hid it under my cape. I tried it on that night when she left me alone to do my lessons. It was so funny. I laughed and laughed at myself in the mirror on my door. Then I got this blue cape out of Prinny's closet. It's her best Sunday cape, you must know. But I had to be covered up, didn't I? If my dress showed, everybody would guess. There is a secret door. Yes, behind the syringa, interrupted Kay. Rosemarie looked at him, surprised. Why, that's my secret door. What do you know about it? I'll tell you afterwards. Only go on with your story. I found it for myself one day. I was playing Indians, you see. Since I was playing alone, I had to be all the Indians and the white settlers too. Well, the Indian chief was just about to catch a white man, only the white man tumbled back into some bushes, and then ran away and got safe. When I tumbled back among the bushes, it was the syringa bush, you know. Why, I tumbled right into that door, and so I found out about it. I used it for all my play after that. It fitted into so many stories. It is such fun. Yes, it must be. I wish we had a secret door. If only Prinny would let us play together, we could share it. You wouldn't need one of your own, Rosemarie spoke wistfully. That's why nobody thought you might be the masker. You used the secret door. Kay was troubled now. Yes, of course, I use it, and then I run from tree to tree, just like the Indians, you know. Nobody has ever seen me from the windows. Prinny wouldn't be looking out anyway. Not then, for she's having supper with the housekeeper. They are having it early tonight because Grandfather's coming home, and they must get me dressed for him. But weren't you afraid of the policeman? No, why should I be afraid of the policeman? Didn't you know he is on the watch for you, to catch you? No, why? Haven't you heard how frightened everybody is of the mask, even some of the grown-ups? Your grandfather has told the policeman to catch you. Not you, of course, the masker. No, I didn't know all that. I wouldn't hear any of it, of course. They would think I might be frightened of the masker myself, I suppose. Rosemarie burst into laughter again at the quaint thought. Oh, it would have been all the more fun if I had known that, she laughed. You wouldn't have been afraid of the policeman if you had known, Kay asked, wondering at her. Yes, perhaps a little, but I would have gone out just the same. Okay, you must never tell on me. It will be so exciting now. But I want the mask, Rosemarie, you see. And then Kay told her all about the Wind Boy. She listened, enchanted, but when he was done, she asked, Aren't you making it all up out of your head? No, no, it is as true. He is very unhappy, but once he gets the mask back and has torn it up, everything will come right with him again. Well, of course, you must take it to him then. He must be clever, the Wind Boy, to have made it so frightening. Only now, Kay, when I give it to you, how am I ever to get into your garden again and look in at your window? If I couldn't play with you, it's been fun to frighten you and have you chase me. Why, last night, when you were after me and I got in at my secret door, it was the most fun I have ever had in all my whole life. Oh, Rosemarie, why don't you ask your grandfather? He might. Rosemarie shook her head. No, he mightn't. Miss Prine is to say about everything. When she says no, I must never ask him. But I should think. Kay had not time to say what he should think, for suddenly a voice came calling, Rosemarie, Rosemarie, where are you? The voice sounded vexed and frightened at the same time, for the artist had returned a little earlier than they had expected, and Rosemarie was not to be found. Miss Prine and Polly had searched the whole house, and now they were calling in the grounds. It was Miss Prine's voice the children were hearing. She had come in her hunting almost to the foot of the stone steps. "Oh, there she is," whispered Rose-Marie. "Oh, bother. Stay here and hide, Kay. Here is the mask. Give it to the Wind Boy. Won't she just be furious about the cape? Though I don't care. It's been worth it playing with you." Then she stood up and ran down the steps. Kay stayed where he was, the mask at his back. "Oh, there you are," he heard Miss Prine's exasperated voice exclaiming. "In my best cape. What will you dare next?" "I shall tell your grandfather." For a long way as they went down the grassy path, Kay heard Miss Prine's quick scolding words, but for some time after the voice had faded out. Kay stayed, thinking he thought, "Rose-Marie's not really naughty, it's just that she has nothing else to do but naughtiness. Nobody to play with. If she could play with Gentian and me, she wouldn't want to take Miss Prine's best cape, and not get her lessons and frighten the children. We'd find plenty to do without that. How jolly it might be. We'd play Indians and shipwreck and everything. Gentian just wants to play fairy stories all the time, but Rose-Marie's different, and there's the secret door and all the gardens." He sat on, his eyes bright, thinking up the things they might do with Rose-Marie. Why, there would be no end to them. But after some time he remembered the Wind Boy and Gentian, who must have come back to the goal long ago, and now must be hunting for him. He picked up the mask and ran away down the steps.